happen to have a Bible, 1 John is where we're going to be. We've been talking about abide, this concept of abide, a word that John uses often, not only in the Gospel of John, but in his letters as well. So it's one of those things when you study the Bible and you see an author use a word over and over again, it's called amplification. It's like having a megaphone. He's trying to get your attention, trying to say this word is important. So we're going to talk about abide and what that might have to do with 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 11 is where we'll be parked for the most part, with a few excursions here and there. Last week, if you recall, we really talked about the fact that John has somewhat of an anger problem. He likes to call people liars. Yes, he is the disciple who Jesus loved. He's the beloved one. He's the one who said that God is love, and he uses the word love more than any author in the Bible. But at the same time, we cannot mask the fact that he is still the son of thunder. I don't think it went away. I just think it was maybe channeled in a righteous direction. We're going to look at that a little bit closer. But if you recall, last week, when we had 3 denials, was probably the first 3-point sermon in history that John gave in that section. But he talked about 3 denials in the end of chapter 1, where he says, if you say this, then basically you're a liar. If you say that you have no sin, then you're deceiving yourself. Again, liar. If you say, hey, there's really no sin at all, then God is a liar. Okay? So he's doing that. And what he was probably doing was paraphrasing or mimicking kind of the common refrain that people who had left the church were saying as they were redefining. Because remember, the last few weeks we said there was kind of a group of people that grew into something called Gnosticism, but this was the beginning of that, where they were redefining who God was or is and redefining what sin is. But I think John was probably paraphrasing them a little bit and saying, hey, there's people out there, they're kind of doing this. If you say, hey, I can have a relationship with God, I can walk in the light, but I can do the things of darkness, he's saying, no, you're a liar. He's calling them out for that. Here, his aim is not so much those that went away, but those that remain. Those that remain. So that's an important distinction here. Let's kind of look at this contrast. In the last section of his letter, aimed at those that left, he was teaching them that their actions and their words proved that they were not walking in the light, that they didn't really know God. They were claiming to know God, but they didn't really know God. Now he's aiming at those that remain, teaching them how they can know that they know God. So in this first verse, 1 John chapter 2, verse 3, he uses the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge or to know. It's the first of 23 uses of that word in this small letter. So again, amplification, it's important. I believe what he's trying to stress to those that remain in the church is this. The culture around you has said we can redefine God and we can redefine what it means to kind of be a Christian. Does that sound familiar? Does that not sound like the culture we're in? I've thought for several years now, our current culture is inching closer and closer to the first century world in terms of culture every single day, especially in the West. Western civilization is inching towards that atmosphere that was back then. It's the same idea. Those from within the church, and I can name names if you want me to, those are the kind of charlatans, the ones we like to call heretics. Usually they're on TV selling you something or wanting your money. But those are the people that are kind of redefining some aspects of God or what it means to be a Christian. And then we have those from outside the church who dabble in Christianity enough and go, but my God accepts all people. Okay, well, yeah, the way they're defining that, So again, it's that let's step away from what this book says and let's redefine who he is and how to act. That's what's happening here. So I think John, as the concern, remember he wrote this likely when he was 90 years old. He's this old man that's got lots of love, but still plenty of thunder, saying, hey, I want you to know that you can know. I want you to be sure that you can know that you're in relationship with God. But he has a few tests I think. He's offering a couple of tests in this passage, and we're going to look at that today. Tests to really prove that you can know that you are abiding. Remember, that's that hold fast living. It's an active thing. To abide is not what you're doing currently. You're sitting, you're occupying space. Some of you are already sleeping. That's okay. But that's not abiding. Abiding is more of an active, your muscles are kind of taut and you're there purposefully, ready to go wherever you need to at any moment, but you're there. There's a purpose to you. It's not passive, in other words. There's almost like an energy ready to happen at any moment, but that's abiding. Steadfast, holding fast living. That's the concept of the Greek word abide. So John is saying you can know that you're abiding in him. You're purposefully, actively choosing to be in him if you pass these tests. So the first one, let's read verse 3. And by this we know that we have come to know him. Two uses of the Greek word gnosis. Because remember, the Gnosticism of that day, it's the same word. It's not Gnosticism. You think it would be, but it's Gnosticism. And he's using that. So Gnosticism was like, hey, this is secret knowledge club. We'll pull back the veil of ignorance if you kind of follow our way of thinking and pull away from the church, right? Pull away from John, Peter, Paul. What do they know? They just walk with Jesus. Who cares? And so we know more, right? That's what was happening. He's saying, no. I'm the original member of the Gnostic club. It's different than you think. So he's saying, verse 3, and by this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. Some translations say obey. That's the idea of it, is keeping and obeying. And there's an action implied with that. An active reverence for God's commandments. So that's really that. It's a simple test. If we keep his commandments, we can know that we know him. And you're like, whoa. Legalism, bro. Like, there's lots of people that go, I keep the law, I do all the things. That test alone is not sufficient. However, I do know this. If you're not at all keeping his commandments and as a habitual, I'm doing my own thing, it's a pretty sure shot that you're not abiding, that you're abiding elsewhere, whatever club or belief system is over here. So in obedience to Christ's commands is just a down-to-earth test of fellowship, test of abiding. That's the positive. So that's the love part coming out in John, saying, hey, if you keep his commandments, you know him. Verse 4, whoever says I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar. That's the word again. It's like the Christian version of liar, liar, pants on fire, right? He's like, man, I want you to know that you can know him. Imagine this 90-year-old man writing this letter. We don't know for sure, but likely to the church at Ephesus that he pastored for so long. He's writing this letter. I want you to know that you can know him if you keep his commandments. Everybody reads that and goes, oh, John did that. Wait, if we don't keep him, we're a liar. It's just like this slam in the face, right? And so there's that thunder coming out of him. He doesn't muddy the waters. There's no gray with John. He sees things in black and white. He says the liar, and the truth is not in him. So you're like, is that the same thing? It's really not. Not only, because if you tell a lie, that's one thing. But if the truth that you compare the lie to doesn't even abide and exist in you, that's a whole nother level of problem, right? I think that's what John's getting at here. And in that if you go around claiming, I am with God, we're good, whatever the slogan of the day is, you look at it from like pop culture icons, music people, movie, sports, being God, all that kind of stuff. But then you see how they live consistently away from God's way, God's commands, God's light. And you go, oh, that doesn't add up. That doesn't jive, right? So I think that's what John's hitting at here. It's kind of that strong son of thunder language. We have to see it that way. Okay, so that's the negative. For a moment, he kind of hits, but then he goes back to the positive. Verse 5. and 6. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. By this meaning going back to if you keep his word. That's a refrain that is repeated. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way that he walked. I think there's a couple things that John's wanting to address here in this part of the letter. Number one, to know his love. So that phrase, the love of God, it can mean two things. In this context or in Scripture, it can mean the love of God is like the perfected in you. It can mean your love for God. That's one meaning we see throughout Scripture. It can also mean God's love for you. I make the case that it means both here. It's a vertical love for God and it's a horizontal as well. Because again, John is the one who uses the word love multiple times throughout his writings, and that's an important thing. He wants you to know that, hey, obedience is not just, or this knowing that you know God, it's not just obey his commands and you're good. Because then that is legalism. He's saying kind of a way that you can know further is obeying and just knowing that he loves you and, hey, you love him. And we'll get into that in a minute. Because that directly ties to obedience. 1 John 4:16 says, so we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love. And whoever abides, there's that word again, in love, abides in God, and God abides in him. So to know God intimately is to know his love. To really know him and know that you have a fellowship with him is to know his love for you. But it's not just knowing his love. If we look at the end of verse 6, whoever says he abides in him. So if you say, I've got that steadfast, hold fast living in God, that's how I'm orienting my life, then you'll walk as he walked. You'll do as he did. Perfectly? No. Will you aim in that direction? Yes. When I was little, I'm talking probably 4 years old, 5, something like that. I went on my first hunting trip with my dad. We're a big hunting family and got 2 older brothers. One who's lived up here in Alaska for 20 years is the hunter of hunters, and the one in the middle between us is not really interested in hunting. He wasn't back in those days, and I wasn't really either at that time. But we go on this hunting trip with Dad, and my dad he's John Wayne reincarnated, and he loves hunting and anything outdoors, and no greater joy that we walk in truth, but that we know how to load a gun. And so those two things. So I'm there on this deer hunting trip in northern Michigan, and I was 4 or 5, and I still remember it. I remember kind of the look on his face actually when my next older brother and I did the following, because my oldest brother was holding the gun and following Dad's instructions and everything, and being super quiet because deer could easily spook and everything. And so doing all the things about me and the one just above, we found these little acorns. Yeah, underneath this oak tree, which you guys don't have around here. But anyways, these little acorns. And my dad and my oldest brother, being super quiet, and we spotted this deer coming, this little kind of blind rear end, and spotted, well, there's a blind coming, some camouflage trees and stuff, so we'd be really quiet. We were told that over and over again. On the way to this hunting trip, that morning, it's got to be super quiet. So my dad's got the gun ready. My oldest brother has got a gun ready because somebody's going to get it, one or the other. And just when that deer was coming closer and in sight of being shot, my dad heard my brother and I pretending these little acorns were matchbox fire with motors. So he just heard this, like all the little noises, and then all of a sudden the deer puts his head up, flag, little tail, and it's gone. In no way was I walking as he walked. I was doing the opposite of what my dad wanted. Now, years later, I have enjoyed hunting, I still do. And what do I recall whenever I go hunting? The things my dad taught me. I think of that moment when I totally blew it, but I was having so much fun with those acorns, and we had like a little city thing all worked out and everything. It was great. Best hunting trip I ever had. But what have I learned since then? That if I want to walk as my dad walked as a hunter, I have to remember his instructions. And if I forget, I call him and go, hey, what about this? And he's got so much knowledge, and he shares it with me. Walking as he walked. So if we say we abide in Christ, we show it by walking as he did, and not the opposite with ignorance. Let's take a closer look at this idea of obedience. There's basically, if you really think about it, there's three motives for obedience. One is because we have to. One is because we need to. And one is because we want to. So think of the have to. That'd be a slave or an indentured servant. We don't really obviously see that in society today, but that would be the idea of if you don't do it, you're punished, right? It's a have to. Obedience, you will do this. Or I guess you could say it's the military as well, but it's that idea of you don't do this, punishment is coming. There's a have to. But there's also the motive of we obey because we need to. That could be an employee. If I don't do what the boss says, I don't get a paycheck, I don't pay the bills, I don't feed the family, we don't have clothes, okay? And so there is a need to obedience in that because there is a reward. And then sometimes it's a want to. And really where you see this play out is in a healthy family relationship. So a family member who obeys because they want to out of love. So a child obeys their parents to please them. Now you could go, wait a minute, for those who have had kids, have children, remember when they were young, you're like, hey, that's not how children always do things. No, it's not. There are times when children will obey because of fear of punishment. There are times when they obey because they want something. And you can sniff that out really quick. They're wanting allowance or keys to the car, whatever it is. But I would say most of the time when that relationship is healthy, it's a want to out of love. I think that's the common illustration maybe to how do you connect this idea of knowing, loving, and obeying? 1993, I was probably the world's biggest idiot in that year. I got like a 4.0 in high school, so school was always easy for me, but motivation was difficult. So I went to college. I went to class when I wanted to. I thought it was more of a suggestion. I've never studied, never really paid attention to things. Knowing things from these very smart professors had no interest to me. But then my sophomore year, I meet this blonde from Kansas. All of a sudden, my motivation to know skyrocketed. But it had nothing to do with college algebra, history, physics, or anything. It had everything to do with this 5'2", eyes of blue blonde from Kansas. And I was obsessed with knowing everything about her. Now, at some point, that college did ask me to not attend there anymore because my grades were so bad. But just so that did improve. That did improve. After I married the 5'2", eyes of blue blonde from Kansas, then I had encouragement and motivation to go back to school and get 4.0 and finish. But the illustration there is I didn't want to learn the books and all that. I had no interest in that. I had interest in something else, though. And that motivation was huge. And then from that knowledge arose a love. So not just getting to know her, but realizing, wait a minute, we're falling in love. We're growing in love together. If you've seen the movie The Princess Bride, the lead character will, at the beginning, would always say, as you wish, as you wish. And then the narrator says that when he said that, he was really meaning, I love you. Right? So it started with a knowledge, this obsessive knowledge. I want to get a PhD in her, right? And then it grows to a love as you get to know one another. And then all of a sudden you're highly motivated to obey. Obey one another and listen to one another and say, okay, those are me. Like when we were dating, whatever she said, when do you need it? Right? I do it. Try to do that still in marriage, but still, it's a little more urgent, it seems, when you're dating. But that obedience came from the love and the knowledge, that interest and that motivation to say, I want to know about you. I want to have a love back and forth between us, and I want to obey and listen to your needs. Okay? That's very similar to what we're talking about here in this relationship with God, this knowing of God. A Christian living in fellowship has a deep love with God, and it results in a want to of obedience. So that's the first test. Obedience is the first test. You want to prove you know Him? You'll obey Him. Will we do it perfectly? No, we're going to fail. We're going to mess up. We're human. But are we not going to pursue that obedience to what He says, how we should live? If we're not doing that, it's a problem. John says, you really are lying and deceiving yourself again. If you are doing that, that is a proof that you have a relationship with Him. So what's the second test? It's closely related to obedience. Very closely. Because of this test of abiding, are you holding fast, living in relationship with Him? John says the first test is obedience to His commands. But the natural question, what command do you think John had in mind? Is that all the Old Testament law? Is anybody wearing two different types of cloth on your clothing right now? That's an Old Testament command. You think he had that one in mind? Is it not eating shellfish, avoiding pork products? What commands did he have in mind? The purity laws, that's myriad numbers of those. Do you think he had those commands in mind? So when John wrote that, no author writes something without something in mind. Now, we're not in his head right now, but can we get some context? I think we can. Verse 7, if you follow me there. Beloved, I am writing you no new command, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. So far, he didn't say much, except that he's not writing something new, but he's writing something old that you should have heard of. At the same time, it's a new commandment. It's new, but it's not new. That I'm writing to you, which is true in Him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Then he goes into more detail here. Whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Hate is a clue. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. Whoever hates his brother and is in the darkness, and walks in the darkness, does not know where he's going, because the darkness is blinding his eyes. I believe what he's referring to here, and every commentator and such that I read said the same thing. I believe he's referring to the commandment from Christ, the new commandment I give you, love one another. That's found in the Gospel of John chapter 13, 34 and 35, Jesus' words, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. Another way to say that, everyone will know that you abide. Everyone will know that you have fellowship. Everyone will know that you are in relationship with me. And I am you. If you love one another. So I think what's happening here is John is often referring back to the teachings of Christ when he says, talking about the word of life, when he's talking about God is light, when he's talking about God is love. Those are all things also found in the Gospel of John. Almost always direct words from Jesus on those things. So I think what John is saying here is that this new command that I give you, that I'm referencing, is not a new command. It's really an old command, but it's also a new command. So how can something be old and also new? Is that possible? Seems like a contradiction. But I think this is maybe what's happening here. Because if you say, well, let's go to this. Mark chapter 12. You want to turn there? That'd be great. Verse 28 through 34. So Mark 12, this is directly the words of Christ. A scribe basically comes to Jesus. Scribe's one of those people who thinks they know more than they do. And they come to him trying to trick him and say, hey, Jesus, what is, Mark 12, what is the greatest commandment out of all the commandments? There's a lot of them. What's the greatest one? And what Jesus does there, he takes these old commandments from the Old Testament, Mark 12, starting in verse 38. In his teaching, he said, beware of the... No, that's not right. I'm sorry. 28, thank you. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked them, which commandment is the most important of all? What's the most important commandment? So Jesus answered, the most important is, and he's quoting Deuteronomy 6, chapter 6, verse 5, called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, mind, and strength. Verse 31, the second is this, you should love your neighbor as yourself. Here he's quoting Leviticus. You should love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And you pass the test, the scribe is satisfied. That's great. So in saying those two things, did Jesus come up with a brand new commandment? No. Loving God and loving your neighbor is throughout the Old Testament. I think what he's doing in making it new, he's actually, well, when you think about it this way, the Greek word here for new is, it's like new in terms of quality, new in terms of character and kind of its design. It'd be like if a brand new car came off the lot that had really never been done before. Something so unique and different. Well, it's got all the parts of the cars that I'm used to. It's got doors and a top, and windows and things, but the way it does things, the way it functions, what it emphasizes and things is different. Like this is like a total redesigning of everything. I've never seen this before. I believe that's the idea that's happening. It's new. Not that the idea was there. In Deuteronomy, love God. In Leviticus, love your neighbor. So then how is it new? Number one, it's new in its emphasis. So the scribe comes to Jesus and goes, hey, what's the most important commandment? And he basically summarizes half the law and says it's love your God with every part of you. Okay. Oh, and then also he summarizes the other half of the law. And by the law, I'm not talking about the 10 Commandments. I'm talking about the entirety of the Old Testament law. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all of that. The other half of that, he's saying love your neighbor as yourself. So it's new in term of emphasis. It's at the top of the list. Loving God and loving your neighbor are up here. And I think I have an idea that John is saying, hey, it's not just about obeying. If you obey, yeah, it's likely that you know him, you're abiding, you're in relationship. But there's got to be a love there. Otherwise, it's just straight up legalism. Anybody can do that. Any cult out there can do that, right? Mormonism or whatever, they can do that better than any Christian that I know. Adhere to a code of conduct. It's legalism. So John is saying, yeah, obeying is part of it, but there has to be a love for God, for your fellow believer that is infiltrating all of that. It has to be there. So Jesus is emphasizing, and John is remembering these words and saying this thing that this new commandment of Christ, it's old, but it's new. It's new in emphasis. It's new in its example. Can you think in the Old Testament of anything that comes close to the example of Jesus Christ? Laying down his life on a cross in the most perfect example and illustration of love that the world has ever seen. So much so that history itself is divided to the year zero because of the light of Christ. There's nothing that even comes close. So it's not only new in its emphasis, it's new in its example. A love like this, an obedient love in the example of that God-man, the Son of God. Daniel 7 talked about the Son of Man, the Son of God, all of that together, that how is he fully God, fully man? We can't wrap our minds around but that guy, Christ, the God-man, the obedient love we've never seen before. So it's completely new in its example. It's completely new in its experience. He uses the metaphor that he did when we talked about last week, the difference between light and darkness. If you're walking in the light, you're not in the darkness. If you're in the dark, you're not in the light. Remember last time we talked about the cave example, going down to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. That idea of, man, when it's pitch black dark and the tour guide turns off all the lights, you see nothing. You do not see this in front of you. You hold up your hand, you can't see it. As soon as that light comes back on, you go, oh, wow. I see stalactites, stalagmites, I see all the stuff. It's awesome. So light and darkness cannot coexist. And again, John is not saying be perfect. Because we fail. But he's saying if you continually stay your abiding and in him, and you continually are over here, probably not in him. You're probably not. Your obedience isn't there, the love isn't there. So a Christian who says they love God and others while hating others is the pinnacle of hypocrisy. It's living a lie. Verses 9 through 11 in 1 John 2, that's what he's talking about here. Whoever says he's in the light, he hates his brother, is actually still in darkness. So you could be like, no, I'm in the light, I'm walking with the Lord, but I got this really problem with this one person in church, and I don't talk to them anymore because they just need Jesus, right? And you have this whole posture towards them of like you avoid the door that they're usually going to go in and out. I'm going to go over here and all that kind of stuff. We've been there before, just frustrated, and then we don't do a Matthew 18 and actually confront and try to make things right, and this bitterness festers. That's the kind of stuff that John's talking about here. If you have a broken fellowship with someone who claims Christ, who claims to abide and know him, but at the same time you're like, I'm so into God and praising him and it's so wonderful. John is saying, just like light and darkness cannot exist in the same space at the same time, you cannot say you walk with the Lord and have a lack of fellowship with your brother or sister. Can't do that. I tell you what, if we look at just our own culture now, we look at the history of the church, that's our problem. It is so much easier to come up with the doctrine, the theology of God, Christology, and all the doctrinal things. You go, I got all these little buckets and neat little lists of what I believe, but my fellow man, that's difficult. That's where it gets real. And that's where we often get off course. So it's like it's two sides of the same coin. I think John is saying you cannot be a growing, maturing Christian and not have fellowship. You can't be growing and maturing. You can't be doing, I'm doing my Bible study. I'm into it every day. Do you attend the things that your brothers and sisters in Christ, like, do you fellowship with them? Do you do the stuff? Are you studying together? No, I'm just kind of doing it by myself and everything. I'm one of those solitary Christians. That's literally not a thing. Unless you're in prison and you have to be in solitary confinement, and then you found Jesus, like, praise God for that. And they're going to keep you there for a while because you probably murdered people and you should be in there. Do all the Bible study. Except for that exception, every believer who is maturing and saying they have a relationship with God has to be in a relationship with others. Again, that's not legalism and me saying, hey, if the church doors are open, you got to go to church. That's junk. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, get with other believers. That could be on a Thursday night where you're going out for food and praying for each other because you're barely hanging on. Whatever that looks like, gather with believers and be with the people of God. And don't let fellowship be broken. I think John is saying there's two tests here. If you listen, he already said to the other guys, they're liars. They've deceived themselves. They said God's a liar. We're done with them. But you that remain, listen. If you want to know that you know God, if you want to know that you're abiding, are you obeying? Are you loving? Two sides of the same coin. Two sides of the same coin. If you obey without love, I think it's legalism. You try to love without actually obeying his commandments, it's a liberalism. It's like, man, I'm just going to love you. I don't care what you identify as and everything. I just accept it. You're coming to my party. I'll be there, whatever it is. It's like, whoever you are, whatever, I love you. It's not love. Because that love has to be tethered to obedience to his word. But it's both. It's both. It's walking his example out. I think we're in fellowship with him as we walk. We're in fellowship with him when we do what he says, when we abide in his truth. If you know who John Philip Sousa is, brilliant musical composer, wrote Stars and Stripes Forever, great piece of music, wrote all kinds of music like that. Stars and Stripes Forever is played at every ball game, every patriotic gathering, great piece of music. There's a story that years ago, John Philip Sousa was in a hotel traveling, and outside his hotel window, he hears a street performer, an organ grinder, grinding away, trying to play Stars and Stripes Forever, and totally murdering the piece. So John Philip Sousa was so irritated because musically, a musician can only handle so much in terms of poor quality music. And so he goes and he confronts the organ grinder and goes out there and says, hey, listen, you got to play it right. So he teaches, he's like, let me just show you something real quick. He instructs him, constantly gives them a free lesson. Do it this way, right? That kind of thing. Spend some time with him and then run on his way. The next night, he's in his hotel room and he hears the same music, but all of a sudden, it's good. It's different. It has a new vitality to it. It's on rhythm and everything. And then he goes down there to see if it's a different musician or whatever, same person. And the guy had put out a sign, pupil of John Philip Sousa. So what difference did the instruction make? What difference did the commands make? When the master composer came down and said, hey, no, you're off course. That sounds terrible. So if you could do it this way, that'd be good. Same thing in our lives. We will sin. John knows we will sin. John sinned when he called down thunder to burn up people that didn't give him a place to stay. He understands sin. But when we're off course, the master comes and says, whoa, get back. Get back to fellowship with me. But my question, as we ponder just before we come to the Lord's table, only as we become obedient to the master's commands, especially to love him and others, will our lives take on a new life and purpose. Is that the state of affairs in your heart today? Are you oriented in a way where you're like, man, obedience and love for God and others, that I think I'm in that direction? If you're not, let's examine ourselves deeply, authentically, before we come to this table.